Hello everybody and welcome back. So last time we saw that our thinking can be predictably irrational in certain contexts. And I had you experience for yourself how when confronted with certain kind of problems or certain kind of riddles, our thinking standardly gets us wrong. And as I said, this is not some feature of your own personal thinking, but this is very much a feature of normal human thinking. And so in this lecture, we're going to see why this is the case. Why are we irrational in certain contexts? Now, this is a very important lecture because it sets a theoretical foundation of the coming lectures. All right, so why are we irrational? Well, to answer that question, we must turn to the architect of our thinking apparatus. Compare it with a piece of technology. Let's say you go out and you buy a calculator, and after trying it out for a few days, you come to the conclusion that certain kind of calculations are always performed badly on this calculator. It always gives you the wrong results. Now, you'd probably come to the conclusion that there's some kind of design bug in that in the calculator, and you'd probably return the calculator and say, well, there's a production mistake here that needs to be fixed. So you will return the calculator to their makers, to its architect, and say, well, there's a bug here in the system. So similarly, confronted with the bugs in our thinking system, we must turn to the architect of our thinking apparatus. And that architect, we know what that architect is since Charles Darwin. That is evolution by natural selection. And as we're going to see, this is a very peculiar architect. First of all, it's an architect that's completely blind. It doesn't have a plan. Secondly, it's an architect that doesn't have any say on the materials with which it's going to work. And then finally, it's an architect that's only interested in one thing, and that is reproduction. But before we get into the consequences of this for our thinking apparatus, it's useful to elaborate a little bit on the process of evolution by natural selection. So evolution, the fact that all living organisms, at least on this planet, have a common ancestor and that species evolve, change over time, well, is mainly driven by the process of natural selection. Now, how does natural selection work? Well, it's a process that works in 3 steps. First of all, you've got random genetic variation arising. Those are random mutations arising in the genetic material of organisms, in the DNA of organisms. And so those mutations, well, they're not guided or directed, they're purely random. This is important. Secondly, those random mutations, well, they will be passed on by the parent organisms possessing them to their offspring. So there's heredity there. We all have 50% of our genes come from our father, 50% come from our mother, and we pass down our genetic material to the next generation, to our own offspring. And also the genetic variation that randomly perhaps arises in our genome. And then the final important step, of course, is selection. Now, when an organism possesses, by pure coincidence, by pure chance, some kind of trait or characteristic that enables it to survive better than other organisms of its population, well, that trait will be selected because those organisms possessing these traits will be able to survive better than the other animals, other organisms, and will pass on more of its genes in consequence. An example might be clarifying here. So a typical example of an adaptation is the long neck of the giraffes. Now this neck gradually grew over the millennia or the hundred thousands of years in the recent evolution of the giraffe. Now, how did that happen? Some people think evolution selects traits that benefit the whole species. Now, this is misguided. Actually, what happens here is that, let's say in an ancestral giraffe population a few million years back, well, all giraffes had very short necks, like the picture you see on the left. Now, just by pure coincidence, some giraffes in that population had a slightly longer neck than others. Just like all organisms, differ from their conspecifics. Some humans are taller than others. Well, some giraffes, by coincidence, had a slightly longer neck than others. Now, those giraffes got a little bit more food than the other giraffes in their population, so they had a better chance of surviving and they had a better chance of reproducing. So that means that they made more babies than the other, on average, than other giraffes with slightly shorter necks. So that means that in the next generation, there are more giraffes with a slightly longer neck because they got those necks from their parents who had an edge over other giraffes in their generation. And again, in the second generation, some will have a slightly longer neck than others. Again, they will have an advantage over others, make more babies, and so forth. And so through the generations, over time, gradually, the neck of the giraffes would grow and grow and grow. All right, this is how evolution by natural selection works. So as a result of this blind process, this can sometimes lead to suboptimal design. Because as I said, evolution has no plan. Natural selection didn't think, okay, let me make a giraffe with really long necks. That's going to be wonderful for those animals because they're going to be able to browse on the high acacia trees. No, it's just by pure coincidence that some giraffes had a longer neck than others, and they had more babies, so that trait was selected over the generations. All right, we've covered that. But so since natural selection has no plan and also no say on the mutations with which it can work, it often leads to suboptimal design. Now take the human eye, or the eye of any mammal for that matter, because they're pretty similar. Now, this is a wonderfully complex and useful organ, I'm sure you will all agree, but there's one weird little bug in that design, and that is the fact that the nerves of the eye, well, they come together in front of the retina and then have to pierce the retina, so make a hole in the retina and connect with the brain. Now, the cause of that is that we have a blind spot in the vision of each eye. That is, of course, corrected for because we have two eyes. But there's an obvious, design bug here. There's a suboptimal design. Squids, for instance, who evolved eyes independently from mammals, so our common ancestor didn't have eyes, have better designed eyes in which those nerve endings actually come together behind the retina, so do not have to pierce through the retina, and they don't have any of those blind spots. Anyways, why is there this design bug? Well, the mammal eye, it evolved from light detecting cells that were under the skin. So our distant ancestor with those first kind of very primitive eyes just had light detecting skins that could tell the difference between day and night. That's all what it could do. And gradually from there, more and more complex eyes would evolve. But in those light detecting cells, and that didn't matter, those nerve endings came together in front of the eye. So when the complex eye we have now evolved, they couldn't redo and redesign the whole thing, and those nerve endings, they still connected in front of the retina, and therefore we have a blind spot. So it can lead to suboptimal design. But more importantly, when it comes to our thinking, is the fact that natural selection, as I said, is only concerned with reproduction. So what does that entail for our brains? Well, on the one hand, we may assume that perhaps better designs could have been possible because we didn't have the best possible mutations to work with, or natural selection didn't have the best possible mutations to work with, and also, just designed our brains from more simpler and simpler brains, and so perhaps just like for the human eye was stuck in, some kind of suboptimal design path. But much more importantly, and what we're going to focus on is, in the context of reasoning errors, is the fact that our brains, or thinking apparatus, was selected only to enhance the reproductive success of our ancestors. A good way to view evolution has been developed by Richard Dawkins in his famous book, The Selfish Gene, is that organisms are actually vehicles used by genetic material to make as many copies of themselves as possible. So in a weird way, you could say it's not the chicken laying eggs to make more chickens, but it is the eggs producing chickens to get more eggs. So it's a genetic material using the organism to make more copies of itself, to make more of that genetic material in the next generation. Of course, it's a metaphor, but it helps to show how it's all about reproduction. So traits that are present in a certain population have been selected because those traits gave a reproductive advantage to those organisms, helped it survive, which is needed to reproduce. So that means that our brains and all of our thinking faculties, that they weren't developed to get as much truth as possible. They weren't developed for truth in the first place. They were developed to enable us to survive and reproduce. Does this mean that truth is irrelevant? Not at all, because while truth is not the end in itself for natural selection when it comes to shaping the brain and shaping our thinking, it is in most cases the best means to get to that end, which is survival and reproducing. Let me give you an example. Imagine a far-off ancestor roaming the plains in Africa, and he sees a beautiful, grot where he wants to, a beautiful cave perhaps, where he wants to spend the night. Now, he looks at the cave, and while he's observing the cave, he sees 3 saber-toothed tigers enter the cave. Now, obviously, he knows those are dangerous animals, and he shouldn't go into that cave, at least not before they came out. Now, a few hours later, he sees 2 saber-toothed tigers leave the cave. Now, if he wasn't very accurately representing the world, if he wasn't really good in basic arithmetics, well, he might assume that now the coast is clear, he might enter the cave, and he wouldn't spread his mathematically inaccurate genes, because there's still 1 tiger there that would have him for lunch. Now, if he would represent the world in a more accurate way and know there's 1 tiger left behind, he wouldn't enter the cave, and so he would reproduce his mathematically accurate kinds. Anyways, very simple example to show that representing the environment in a truthful way is in general the most effective way to survive and to thrive in that environment. But truth is very expensive. Representing the world in a complex and accurate way is something that requires a lot of brain power. Now, human brains, they weigh not even 5% of our body mass, but they consume up to 20% and sometimes even more if we're doing a lot of thinking of our energy. So it's an incredibly expensive organ. And natural selection would only select such an organ if it increases the chances of survival and reproduction of the organism. Now, because it's such an expensive organism, because it requires so much energy, it also required our ancestors to find more food in order to maintain that organ, to keep it working. So there's a heavy price tag connected with accurate representations of the world. And that is why many species have much smaller brains requiring much less energy, because it's just more efficient. You don't need a lot of food for it. So what evolution wanted, and of course wanted is between brackets because it's a blind, mechanism. It's not any kind of conscious designer. But what natural selection wanted for us and what it created for us is a thinking system that would work very quickly and that would be very frugal, that would be very economical, that wouldn't require a lot of energy and that wouldn't require a lot of information. Remember our ancestor looking at the cave, seeing the saber-toothed tigers enter and go out? Well, he obviously had to act fast on that information, and he didn't have the luxury of having even a larger brain and being able to represent the world even more accurately and so forth. So we've got a cheap and fast working thinking system. And that thinking system is what Kahneman and Tversky, but Tversky passed away, and so Kahneman has developed this some more in his latest book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which you see here, calls System 1. Now, System 1 is our fast automatic thinking system. We're not conscious of our own thinking. It's just, always present, always giving us a certain answer to our different question. It's kind of what we do on autopilot. But then we also have another system, because sometimes System 1 simply doesn't have an answer. So we also have what Kahneman calls System 2. And System 2 is our slower, conscious thinking processes, and these require a lot more effort from us. So if I ask you, multiply 25 times 96, well, you're starting to concentrate and you're starting to use System 2. If I just ask you 2 plus 2, System 1 screams number 4. There's a nice clip on YouTube explaining in a very fun and light-hearted way System 1 and System 2. So do go to the slides on Canvas and click on that clip. All right, so 2 thinking systems. 1, fast automatic based on intuition, System 1. The second one, slow, effortful, conscious, reflective thinking, System 2. Now let's see who's running the show. I've got 2 more riddles, and I want you to go or to detect the first answer that springs to mind. How many animals of each kind did Moses take in the ark? Now I'm sure, and I don't need to give you lots of time for that your System 1 has been very active and is screaming 2 in your ear. But if you look closer to this question, if you start using System 2 now, there's something wrong with that question. And so perhaps you can pause the recording if you didn't already see what's wrong here, and you can see if System 2 can correct System 1. All right, as some of you may have discovered, perhaps most of you, it is not Moses who took two animals of each kind in an ark. It is Noah who did so. But System 1 just went along with it, and because Moses fits in the biblical sphere, didn't see anything, no alarm bell went off, so was screaming 2 in your ear. At least that is if you think like most people. Second example, similar thing. A baseball bat and a ball cost $1.10 together. The baseball bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Again, here probably System 1 is screaming in your ear, well, the ball will cost 10 cents, that's $1, 10 cents, $1.10 together. But again, if you use your slow, effortful System 2 thinking, you may find out that that is not the right answer. So again, I'll give you time to pause if you want to. The answer actually is 5 cents. If the ball costs 5 cents, well, then the bat costs $1.05. That's $1 more than the ball, and together that adds up to $1.10. If you say the ball costs 10 cents, then it would add up to $1.20. But again, those examples are just made to deceive us because we got a very fast, simple answer from our intuition, and we don't take time to really do the thinking here. Anyway, so you see, the one who's running the show in general is system 1. Kahneman calls system 2 the lazy controller. Can check on system 2 and set system can check on system 1 and set system 1 right when system 1 goes wrong, but most of the time just it remains in the background and lets system 1 run the show. All right, so why is system 1, why is our fast and intuitive thinking fallible? And all of the examples we saw in last lecture, all of those riddles and questions and so forth, well, they're also kind of designed, to get the wrong answer from system 1. So they're designed to mislead our intuitive thinking. And so that's why we in general get it wrong. But so there are 3 important reasons why our intuitive system 1 thinking is not always trustworthy. And the first has everything to do with the fact that thinking requires energy, requires more brain power, good thinking at least, complex thinking, and that therefore we need a lot more resources, a lot more food to maintain these larger brains and these effortful thinking processes. So evolution, as I pointed out, equipped us with a fast and frugal thinking system, a frugal thinking system, one that doesn't require a lot of information, doesn't require a lot of time, and doesn't require larger brains and lots of efforts. And so the way that intuitive thinking system often works is by applying heuristics. Now, heuristics are simple rules of thinking, and we're often not conscious that we're using these heuristics, but this is actually what happens. And these heuristics will give us an answer fast and very fast. And so these heuristics, well, they are a means of getting as much relevant truth about our environment in as cheap a way as possible and as fast a way as possible. So it is very much a matter of simplicity above complexity. Now remember the example or the question, the riddle I presented you with in last lecture, the one on what is more likely, dying from a shark attack or dying from dislodged parts of aircraft. Now, as we've pointed out, you're 30 times more likely to die from a dislodged part of an aircraft, but most people tend to think a shark attack is more likely. And the reason for that is because we can much more readily imagine shark attacks. So it's much more easy to recall or at least to imagine, and therefore we think it is more likely. So the heuristic we're using here unconsciously is when we're asking ourselves how likely an event is to occur, well, how easy is such an event to imagine or to recall from, a basic quick memory check. And so because there's many more movies about shark attacks, and when it happens, it's all over the newspapers, we think this is more likely. Now, in most cases, that availability heuristic, as they call it, that simple thinking rule that says the more easy it is to recall, the more likely it is to happen. Well, in most cases, this will work perfectly fine because stuff that is easy to recall, easy to imagine, is typically stuff that happened a lot in the past, and so it's likely to happen a lot in the future as well. But in some situations, in some contexts, well, it can deceive us, like in this case. And then they talk about the availability bias. So what we do here is intuitively, we're actually replacing what is otherwise a complex statistical analysis that requires a lot of information. What is more likely to happen? You need a lot of information for that statistical analysis. It replaces it with a very simple rule of thumb. What is more easy to recall or to imagine? All right, that's one reason why our intuitions can go wrong. The second reason is called error management. Our intuitions do not only go wrong because they prefer simplicity above complexity, but also sometimes our intuitions are made in such a way, or the heuristics we apply are designed in such a way that they will make more mistakes in general just to avoid costly mistakes. Now remember the goal of natural selection when it designed everything, including our brains. Well, the goal here is to have us survive and reproduce. Now, we can make certain kind of mistakes that are much more costly than other kind of opposite mistakes. And when that is the case, natural selection will endow us with intuitions that will make more mistakes just to avoid those costly mistakes. This should become clear with the following example. And I also call it like the fire alarm principle. Now think about a fire alarm. Now a fire alarm can make two mistakes. It can go off when there's no fire, a false positive. Or it can not go off when in fact there is a fire, a false negative. Now, one of those two mistakes is much more costly than the other, and that doesn't take a lot of thinking. Well, obviously, the false negative, not going off when there is in fact a fire, is a potentially much more costly mistake than going off when there's no fire, for instance, when somebody lit a cigar in the room. So in order to avoid costly mistakes, what do those engineers who make these fire alarms do? Well, they make it in such a way that it will often go off when there's no real fire, just to avoid it not going off when there actually is a fire. So they will kind of set it in an over-detection mode, that it will rather detect a fire too quickly than not quickly enough. Something similar goes for our thinking. One other more light-hearted and perhaps funny example of this kind of error management is what is called male sexual overperception, and that is the fact that men tend to overestimate the interest that women have for them. And from an evolutionary perspective, this is quite logical, because the mistake by thinking a woman is not interested when in fact she has an important reproductive cost, while the opposite mistake of thinking someone is interested while in fact she was not, leaves a bruised ego, but nothing too bad there, right? But so much more relevant for this course and for our thinking apparatus and for our reasoning errors is the fact that error management has endowed us with an over-detection of causal connections. Because it was so important, and it still is very important, to detect important causal connections, for instance, between eating a certain food item and being sick, because it is poisonous, a poisonous plant, and the sickness. Well, in order to not miss any of these very important connections, natural selection endowed us with a thinking mechanism that over-detects causal connections. So we're detecting too many causal connections that aren't there, because that system has been wired in such a way never to miss relevant causal connections, and is prepared to detect to over-detect causal connections that weren't there. And so this is the breeding ground for lots of domains of irrationality, and we'll get to those in the coming lecture, like superstition, pseudosciences, conspiracy theories. But then also we have what they call a hyperactive agency detection. So we're also over-detecting something here because of error management, and now it is the action of an agent. So between an agent is loosely defined as a living being with intentions. Can be another human, can be an animal. And so the typical example here goes as follows. Now, again, imagine an ancestor of ours, and he's roaming the plains again, the savanna of Africa, and now he's seeing a bush at some distance, and he hears rustling in that bush, and he sees movement in that bush. Now, he can make two mistakes. And again, this is extremely simplified just to give you the gist of it. He can make two mistakes. He can think, there's a predator in there. Well, in fact, it was just the wind playing in the bush. Or he can think, it's just the wind, but in fact, there was a predator crouching there ready to devour him or her. So again, there's one mistake that's much more costly than the other. Thinking it's a wind while in fact it was a predator is a very costly mistake. The other mistake is not costly at all. You would just get away from the bush for no real reason. And so, much like for causal connections, we're over-detecting the actions of agents behind certain kind of events when in fact they weren't caused by any kind of agent whatsoever. And this is a breeding ground, and we'll develop that in the coming lectures, of religion. And then finally, the third reason why our intuitions, why system 1 is not always trustworthy, is because those intuitions or the heuristics we apply in that intuitive kind of thinking, they were developed by natural selection for us to thrive in our ancestral evolutionary environment. And sometimes they're not well suited to deal with issues in our modern environment. A good example, but not a cognitive one, but a good example of such a mismatch is the way our taste is wired. Now, humans in all cultures and from a very young age, they like calorie-dense foods and they also like sugary foods. And that's why things like McDonald's have such an enormous success. Now, obviously, in our modern environment filled with cheap fast food options, that doesn't always lead to very good outcomes for our chances of survival and reproduction. It leaves us with obesity, it leaves us with diabetes, with heart failure, and so forth. But in our ancestral environment, in our evolutionary environment, those taste preferences were actually very important in getting us to survive, because that was an environment characterized by food scarcity. So it gave us huge motivation to actually access and consume calorie-rich food, which could make the difference between surviving and starvation. And it also guided us towards ripe fruit, the only sugary substances we would have accessible to us, which were very necessary for consuming vitamin C. And so while these taste preferences were very instrumental for survival and reproduction in our normal evolutionary environment, they no longer are in our modern environment. Now, something similarly related to reasoning errors we can see with the gambler's fallacy. Now, the gambler's fallacy, well, consists of or has been discovered in casinos, for instance, where you see that gamblers, when they play, for instance, the roulette wheel, and they end it on the red little spots for, let's say, 3 or 4 times in a row, that they will often, bet a lot of money on it landing on the black stripe the next time, because they think, well, 4 or 5 times red in a row, that seems statistically very, improbable. So they intuitively expect some kind of statistical correction. Now, of course, the roulette wheel doesn't have any kind of memory, and the chances of landing on red or black are 1 in 2 every single time. But according to psychologists, well, there's a reason for that kind of intuitive expectation of statistical correction, because much of our thinking in evolutionary times, again, well, was designed to deal with predictions which were in fact cyclical in nature. Think about the weather. When you live in a place where there's a lot of rain during a certain season, and you had a dry spell for a long time, for 4 or 5 days, perhaps for 2 weeks, well, then in fact the chance of rain increases by every day the dry spell lengthens. So in that sense, this kind of expectations would have been correct. And the same goes for other cyclical stuff that our ancestors needed to predict, like migrating patterns of herds of prey animal, and also the ripeness of certain edible plants and so forth. The world was very much cyclical, and so expecting, the cyclicality is something that is actually ingrained in our intuitive thinking, but it can go wrong in modern contexts, like in the casino, where it's completely randomized. But more generally, our kind of intuitive thinking in many ways is not well suited to estimate, risk of a certain kind of financial investments or do science in general. All right, so let's take stock about what we said so far. So we've got two thinking systems. System one, fast and automatic thinking system, works fast and frugally, doesn't require a lot of information, doesn't require any effort. And then system two, or effortful slow thinking, which remains lazy for the most time. So in general, remember our two examples with Moses and the baseball bat. Well, in general, we just let system one do its thing as long as system one comes up with an answer. It's only when we're confronted with a problem that only system two can do something with, like 25 times 97, that we actually go on and use system two. But critical thinking is very much knowing when system one, when our intuitive thinking is not reliable, knowing when there are certain kind of cognitive pitfalls, and using system two, or slow, effortful thinking, to check the outputs of system one. But as we'll see, even system two can be untrustworthy. And that has everything to do with the following. Now, our thinking is not only adapted to surviving in our natural environments. We're social animals, we're social primates, and so our chances of survival and reproduction depend to an important degree on our position and our interactions within our group, within that social environment. And in that social environment, truth is no longer as important as it was in our natural environment. In fact, in the social environment, in our interaction with other people, some subtle forms of deception, unnoticed deception, often go a long way and give us an edge over others. Take, for instance, a situation in which I'm having a conflict with another person within the group. Now, I would be better served, my interests would be better served, or would be better off if that other person kind of overestimates my physical strength, or overestimates the number of people that would take my side in the conflict and that would be willing to fight for me and defend me. That way, he may just give me whatever I want and back off without me having to engage in potentially very harmful physical confrontation. Also, my talents are better overestimated by my peers in the group, because that way I'll get a higher status within that group, and with that higher status we will get, or people get, more reproductive opportunities and a better chance to survive in the first place. So deception is something that, again, subtle, unnoticed deception is something that can give an edge in this social context to individuals. Now, the best way to deceive others is to deceive oneself. And that is why System 1 endowed us with a kind of ingenious bias, and that is the bias of self-overestimation, which we talked about last time. The fact that most people think they're better than average drivers, more social skills, more intelligent, less biased, and so forth. Well, all of that kind of subtle self-deception, at least for some people, well, that has an important role in this kind of social context. Because, as they say, the best liar is the one who doesn't know he's lying. So if I believe I'm talented, I have all of this, well, I at least have a shot of convincing others of that. If I don't believe it in the first place, well, then obviously nobody else is going to believe that. So self-deception as a trick to deceive others as well in a subtle way and give us some kind of edge in a social context. And this social context is also responsible for the fact that System 2 can kind of deceive us, or at least that our System 2 or slow, effortful thinking processes do not always lead to true representations, to true beliefs. Now you see, System 2 has not only evolved to, provide an answer about a natural environment when system 1 didn't have an answer, or check up on system 1 when it's not really reliable and we think it's very important, so we do some thinking about it. System 2 has also been developed, or did also evolve, and perhaps did in the first place evolve to argue with others and convince others in our group. That is called the so-called argumentative theory of reason, or reasoning processes. So all of that slow thinking that we're conscious of, well, is developed or did evolve in the first place to win arguments we have with others and to convince others in the group. So in a way, we're born lawyers. We're not so much born scientists or philosophers looking at truth or getting to truth. We're very good at defending our own points of views. We're not so good at seeing the whole picture. And the bias that helps us with that, the bias that really shows how that system 2 thinking is geared, is geared towards convincing others, is the confirmation bias. Now, what a confirmation bias does for us, it makes sure that we will never miss any kind of piece of information or any argument that supports our own belief, that supports our own conviction. But it will make us selectively blind to all counter evidence or all counter arguments that would put a big question mark behind or after our conviction. The confirmation bias also makes sure that whenever there's kind of ambiguous information, we'll interpret it without thinking twice as something that supports our own belief or conviction. And then finally, the confirmation bias ensures, as I said, that we never miss a piece of confirming evidence for our beliefs. So it seems that we remember much better confirming evidence and arguments that support our own case than counter evidence or counter arguments. Now, because of that confirmation bias, we also suffer from another important bias, and that is the overconfidence bias. Because we only see confirmation for our own beliefs and we miss all of the possible counter arguments and the counter evidence, well, in general, we're way too sure that our belief is actually correct. And the confirmation bias, well, was established or kind of discovered, but people have known it all along. Francis Bacon kind of wrote about it several centuries ago. But scientifically, psychologists really discovered that confirmation bias in the 60s. And there was this interesting experiment done in the United States in which psychologists, well, they got a group of people together, and half of that group were people who were strongly in favor of the death penalty. The other half were people who were strongly against the death penalty. It's still a debate that is raging today, but so it was already raging in the 60s. And what these psychologists did, well, was they gave a bunch of articles, and all of those articles were fictional, scientific articles. And some of those, gave arguments to defend the death penalty, like saying there's a strong correlation between death penalty and the amount of crimes that are being committed, and heavy crimes. So the more, if you have death penalty, there's much less, serious crime, for instance. And then others gave arguments for people against the death penalty, saying there's no link whatsoever. And when you have the death penalty, there's even more criminality in some kind of perverse way. Anyways, the articles went all over the place and gave arguments to both sides. Now, the psychologists expected that, given the fact that the evidence is very not clearly in one particular way, well, they would kind of diminish or be somewhat less convinced of their position. But actually, the opposite happened. What happened is that people were even more convinced after reading all of these articles than before, that were even more convinced of their standpoint. So for one part, that was that the death penalty should be instaured, and the other ones that it should be abolished. And the reason for that was, of course, their strong confirmation bias. So also in the talks afterwards, when the psychologist asked them, no, but why exactly are you even more convinced now of your position? They would remember all of the arguments and all of the information that was being given in these articles that would support it, that supported their case, and they didn't remember, or almost not, any of the other arguments that were being given, all of the counter arguments, and all of the ambiguous information they clearly interpreted in the light of their position, right? So people have a very strong filter in which they view the world, and all of the information that somehow fits in with their opinions and so forth is easily taken up. The rest is just being filtered out. And this, as you can imagine, has extremely important consequences for our thinking. That's why I call the confirmation bias the mother of all biases. And another interesting thing about the confirmation bias is that the more emotionally invested we are in certain kind of beliefs, the stronger the confirmation bias becomes. That's why with opinions like pro and con death penalty, these are often opinions that people are very, emotional about. Well, the confirmation bias is extremely strong. Because we are, rather than cool-headed robots, we're warm-blooded primates, and like many other animal species, there's a very important affective component driving our actions and our behavior. And the reason why we have strong emotions and strong feelings, why we evolved these kind of psychological features, well, is pretty obvious. Natural selection is only interested in actions, in actual behavior that enhances survival or reproduction. And in order to get to the proper actions, you don't only need, cognition. You don't only need this kind of guiding factor, what am I going to do? But you also need this motivating factor that really pushes you and drives you to engage in certain kind of actions that help you survive and reproduce. So there's these two important components of our psychology. There's the emotions as a driving factor, and there's cognition as the guiding factor. For instance, I'll go and open the fridge, for instance, because of a driving factor, because I'm hungry, and also because of a cognitive element, a guiding factor, because I know there's food in that fridge. And you can analyze a lot of human behavior in terms of these two components. Now, these two components work beside each other and work with each other, but sometimes these components influence one another. And in particular, our emotions or affective feelings, well, they can profoundly influence our cognition. And this is called the affect heuristic. Now, the affect heuristic consists in not taking decisions after rationally weighing in pros and cons, but actually guiding ourselves or having ourselves guided, having our decisions guided by an affective response. And now we all suffer from it to some extent or another. You see, for instance, that many amateur investors, they're guided by their affect heuristic, investing in certain things that look good, that give them a good feeling, and not in others, but not really doing the math and not really weighing pros and cons. And the affect heuristic can have profound consequences when you think about policy making, for instance. Now, I like to compare two recent, or they're not so recent, but anyways, two threats, societal threats, and the way societies or modern societies have chosen to deal with them. And those two threats are climate change and terrorism. Now, climate change, well, scientists have been saying louder and louder for the last decades that it is a major problem and that we should curb our greenhouse gas emission as soon as possible to ensure a good future for all. But the reaction to that, or at least the actions that were being undertaken, were pretty slow in the making, and to a certain extent are still lagging behind and still pretty slow. And an important reason for that, and there's more reasons like the problem of international cooperation, but an important reason for that is that it doesn't produce a huge affective response. It's all kind of abstract. Yeah, well, the global temperature is rising slightly, the poles are melting. We know some elements about it, and especially in the beginning, there wasn't much, affective response to this kind of slowly evolving threat. Whereas terrorism, on the other hand, well, it has, after 9/11, well, the whole world kind of changed because of terrorism. Security measures were extremely ramped up in almost all airports. Now it takes like 45, 50 minutes longer, perhaps an hour longer to go through security and board a plane. So there was a huge, immediate and very strong reaction by the policymakers and the people in charge of countries, nations, and so forth, because of the terrorist threat, where in fact terrorism, when you look at it statistically, is or objectively is a much, much lesser threat than climate change. Very few people will die from terrorism and have died from terrorism so far, if you consider the global population, of course. And there's already many, many more victims from climate change, and this will only get much worse in the future. But so the reason why we take very strong measures against one threat and not so strong measures against the other more important threat has a lot to do with, the affective response. And of course, terrorism is geared towards creating the most extreme affective response. It's this kind of form of asymmetrical warfare. You try to induce fear in the heads of your enemy, and that's what actually works very effectively. And then one last important bias I want to talk about is the so-called in-group, out-group bias, and it has everything to do with our social emotions. Now, the in-group, out-group bias is the fact that we're much more trusting and we have a much more positive disposition towards people within our own group, and you can define it as, culturally, linguistically similar people. And obviously in ancestral time, those would have been the people of your tribe for a very long time. Now it has become more complex in modern times, but we still see this very strong bias in which people who share our culture or language and so forth, we have much more trust. We trust them much more than people outside of these groups, people speaking foreign tongues, having very different cultures, different religions, and so forth. Now, of course, this in-group and out-group bias has profoundly disastrous effects on human society and had those for a very long time. We can kind of analyze all group conflicts, all warfare in terms of this strong bias, but also social exclusion of various groups, racism, and so forth. But when it comes to reasoning and reasoning errors, well, this in-group and out-group bias also has an important consequence for the way or the ease with which we're going to take over certain kind of beliefs. Now, beliefs coming from our close environment will take them up pretty uncritically. Beliefs coming from people from different groups, we are very skeptical towards. And this kind of also explains why things like religion spread so easily, and we take on those beliefs which can seem pretty extreme and pretty extremely irrational without second thought, because we get them from a very young age from the people we trust the most in our close environments. All right, that's it for the lecture today. So let us briefly summarize. And again, I would suggest that you would pause the recording and try to answer these questions for yourself. So what are the two thinking systems we have and what do they consist of? Well, we have system one, or fast, automatic, and intuition-based thinking system. And then we have system two, or slow, effortful, reflection-based system. The thinking we're doing when we're consciously thinking, and that requires a lot of energy and effort from us. Why is system one fallible? We're looking for three important reasons. Okay, so first of all, it is frugal, it is economical. It chooses simplicity above complexity. Secondly, there's error management. Sometimes it's geared toward making more mistakes in order to avoid costly mistakes. Remember the fire alarm principle. And then finally, in some contexts, there's an evolutionary mismatch. Those intuitions, they were developed to deal with certain problems that were recurring in our ancestral evolutionary environment. Now we unleash them in a very different modern context, and sometimes they misfire. Why is system 2 fallible? Well, because it is adapted to the social context. System 2 is not only adapted to think about the natural world, but also to function in the social world, to convince others, to win arguments for others. And what is the bias that helps us with that? Again, very important. The mother of all biases, the confirmation bias. We're only seeing confirming evidence, and we're not seeing counter-arguments, counter-evidence, and so forth. So we're born lawyers, we're not born scientists. We're geared towards convincing others, not towards getting to the true gist of things. And then finally, what is the third source of irrationality? Emotions, of course. We're not cool-headed robots, we're hot-headed primates, and our emotions do influence our thinking. We've talked about the affect heuristic. We also talked about the in-group, out-group bias, which is also a very important bias. Now, next time we're going to see what all of this leads to. We're going to see irrationality in action and discuss domains of irrationality. And then after that, we'll be all set to talk about how we can improve our own thinking, how we can guard our thinking against these reasoning errors. I know this was pretty heavy theoretically, but as I said, it's an important foundation on which we're going to build now. So please do also read the transcripts I gave you carefully, because this is important stuff. All right, thank you so much for your attention, and see you next time.